Hi, everybody. This is Jenny Morris with the Autism Support of Alabama. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar Wednesday. We are being joined today by Cecilia Ballinger with ADAP, the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program. Just to give you a little background on Cecilia, she's been working with ADAP since she was a clerk in law school. During that time, she worked primarily on special education issues and developed a passion for medical advocacy. Inspired by this work, she wrote and received funding for a two-year Equal Justice Works Fellowship, focusing on the needs of children with medical complexities across the state. Cecilia graduated from law school in May of 2024 and is in her first year of her fellowship with ADAP. Cecilia received undergraduate degrees in philosophy and sociology from UAB and has always been passionate about removing barriers and inequalities in our education system. She is excited to continue her legal advocacy work with ADAP and to continue serving the medically complex community through her fellowship work. She will be speaking to us today regarding IEPs, and let me introduce Cecilia Ballinger.
Hello.
Hey there. Thank you for joining us today, Cecilia.
Thank you for having me. So like Jenny mentioned, I am a staff attorney with ADAP here through an Equal Justice Works Fellowship. So my work does focus on our medically complex children. So I will help with both Medicaid and special education issues, but here we're talking about just basically top 10 advocacy strategies in special education issues that we see pretty often in our special education work and ways that parents and caregivers can advocate for children in those settings. Right. So a little bit about ADAP. We provide information and referral services, but then we also do provide case advocacy in some situations. What that basically means is if you have a disability related question, you can call us, set up an intake appointment, and talk through kind of what's going on that is disability related. And we will assess how we can help, what information might be helpful for you. In some cases, that will get referred up to an advocate or an attorney, and we will actually work directly with you on your case. So we do have that phone number, online intake form, and we split it up into children's and community access teams. Today, we're going to be talking about a lot of things, so I'll be going a little bit fast. As you have questions, please just pop them in the chat. Don't include any personally identifiable information, just because this will be recorded and posted, I believe. So I would prefer that we don't tell your children's biographies on the internet publicly. But vague wording is fantastic. We're going to be going through just strategies for preparing for the meeting. So who to invite, what is your strategy going to be, what is a NOPRA, and how are we going to use that. We're going to talk a little bit about behavior, both thinking broadly about behavior and bringing in assistance. We're going to be talking about assistive technology. A lot of people aren't really sure what all that entails or how to ask for it. We're going to be talking about services, who's providing them, how are they providing those services, where are they providing those services. We're going to be talking about evaluations, what can you get evaluated in, and a method called an independent educational evaluation that we can use when school evaluations aren't giving us kind of what we need to know for the IEP. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about goals, both the role of data and how to write our goals. So first, when preparing for the meeting, we talk about who to invite. There is a list of people who are going to be at every single meeting. Your general education teacher, your special education teacher and case manager. A lot of times we'll have a special education coordinator or an assistant come in representing the school. We'll have a principal or assistant principal present, and you parent will be there as well. But there are more folks that we can have at that meeting. So you as the parent, or if your student is old enough that those rights have transferred to them, they are welcome to invite anyone who would be helpful in that meeting, whether that is, it is supposed to be showing. Here we go. Okay, can we see the screen now? Um, Yes. Okay. Beautiful. Sorry about that. Um, Let me go back. Okay. This is our ADAP information. All of our intake information, everything like that is also available on our website, which is, I think, just adap.ua.edu. Um, these are all of our topics for today. This is where we are. So who to invite to our meeting? Like I was saying, you parent or student, we can invite a family friend even. I know a lot of times when we're going into those meetings, parents, you go in and it's like 8 people at a table and you. And it can feel very much like they have all of the power, you don't have any power, and it can be overwhelming. It's a very emotional process. We're talking about your kid. So many parents find it helpful to bring in a friend, a neighbor, something like that, to, if nothing else, take notes, and just be a second person listening. They're able to engage with the team. They can ask questions. If it is a neighbor maybe who babysits your kid often, they might have things that they notice with behaviors or skills that they want to ask the team about. You can also invite various therapists. So if you know that your child has communication difficulties and that's something that you want to talk about at the IEP meeting, you can request specifically that the speech therapist be present at that meeting, because they're going to be able to offer information to the team that is absolutely necessary for that IEP meeting. So before your meeting, really important to just think through that list of people of who are we getting information from, who would be helpful to have at that meeting to either take notes and support you as parent, as advocate, or who would be helpful to give information. Um, the other thing that I really recommend my parents do, is review the draft of the IEP ahead of time. The school gets to do it. Why don't you? So a week before the IEP meeting, you send out an email like the one here. Good evening, Miss Jones. I hope you've had a great week so far. I'm looking forward to our meeting next week to discuss Jimmy's IEP. To help us use our time efficiently at the meeting, can you send me a copy of the draft IEP at least 3 days in advance of the meeting? Not all schools will. Most will, in my experience. They're writing that IEP ahead of time, and so they will send it to you, and that way you actually have a chance to read it before sitting down at that meeting. And I know when we're in those meetings, our adrenaline is pumping, cortisol is going, we're kind of panicked, people are staring at us, all of these things that make it hard to read that IEP and provide thoughtful feedback. So I recommend my parents go ahead and just reach out a week before, get that draft IEP. Once you get that IEP, read it line by line, mark it up with a highlighter, write notes in there, all of the things that you need to do to get organized, and know what's going on with your kid. Um, so that is kind of the indispensable one is if you're walking into the meeting without that information, it's really challenging to stay calm and advocate for those things that you know that your child needs. The other piece, this is emailing again. I really do recommend my parents email their parental concerns. So in our IEP, on that very first page, the second or third box has a section for your parental concerns about your child's needs. Um, a lot of times the way that that is filled out is the school will send a parent survey home, you fill out the survey, send it back, they kind of paraphrase what you said and put it into this parental concern section, and it kind of captures what you're worried about, but a lot of times the paraphrasing makes it sound like maybe you're less frustrated than you actually are, or you're happier with services than you are, or it's just not really getting the specifics that you're concerned about. Maybe there wasn't a question about it in the parental concerns survey that they gave you. So I have my parents send an email. Just good evening, Miss Jones. In preparation for our meeting tomorrow, please add the following as written to the parental concern section of the IEP. And there's just 3 bulleted concerns. So I would like all of Jimmy's teachers and aides trained on his AAC so they can model its use consistently for him. I want him to go to specials with his non-disabled peers. I'm concerned that he hasn't made any progress on his math ACAP scores, that state testing, and want to discuss additional supports for him. And the reason we do this is twofold. One is your IEP is a legal document. Everything that is in it matters. Every service that the school says they're going to provide, they are bound to provide that. When you have a parental concern section that has those concerns bulleted out like that, it is like candy for attorneys, because it shows that the school knew. in this legal document, they knew that this concern was going on. So, God forbid you get to a point down the road where maybe you do need to escalate and get an attorney's assistance and getting services in the school. Having an IEP showing that you were concerned about this issue year after year and services were not provided to help with that issue can help get you some more services and give that attorney a little bit more to work with because they can point and show in this IEP, parent was concerned about this and that, and it wasn't addressed. Um, it also is just helpful for everyone to be on the same page. And it flips the script a little bit. Instead of you walking in and kind of just waiting to hear what the school is going to tell you and take in that information, and maybe you have a few questions scratched out, um, it flips it. So you've already told them what you want to talk about, um, and they address it. Right. It puts that burden back on them in a way and shifts just the power dynamics that are happening in the IEP meeting. So pair that review of the IEP so you know what we're actually talking about in the meeting. And if you can't decipher the IEP, there are lots of people that can help, whether that's ADAP, whether that's your autism support, whether that's APAC, Alabama Parent Education Center. There are people who we can contact to just talk through these issues. But then also sending our concerns ahead of time to make sure that at that meeting we are focused on the actual concerns that you have, the actual conflicts that are going on or areas of need that are being unmet, and can really help us refocus our meeting. The other piece in preparing for your meeting to keep in mind is something called a NOPRA. It's a notice of proposal or refusal to take action. Every state has a version of this. A lot of places will call it a prior written notice or a PWN. In Alabama, we call it a NOPRA. And this basically, anytime that the school decides to take an action or not take an action regarding your child's special education, you are actually entitled to a written notice in the form of a NOPRA saying what decisions were considered, why they chose the decision that they chose, what that decision is. Um, and it can get us out of a lot of tricky positions. So, for example, say I went to the school and I am asking for some more occupational therapy services for my child. I say, we're getting 30 minutes once a month. I really think that we need 30 minutes every week. That's how desperately we need those fine motor skills. The school says, we really just don't have the number of therapists we need to be able to do it that often. And also, like, your child doesn't really need occupational therapy every single week. And they just say that. That, for a parent, cuts off that conversation and makes it really hard to come back and disagree because they're the expert in this. They know what they're talking about, or that's what we think. So this NOPRA, by knowing what it is, knowing how to ask for it, it can actually recenter that conversation again. So when the school comes back and says, we don't have that staff, we don't do that service here, he doesn't need that service. You can say, okay, I hear what you're saying. Could you give me a NOPRA saying that and explaining just why we're making that decision? And you're legally entitled to that NOPRA. If you're not comfortable doing it right there in the meeting, you can send an email after asking for one. You can say, "Hey, I asked for occupational therapy services once a week, and you said that that wasn't an option. That once a month was sufficient. That you didn't have sufficient therapy services to provide it more often than that. Can you provide me with a written notice about that decision?" In the back of our Write Not a Favor book, that is online. The free PDF is on our website under children's section. There are a bunch of form letters in the back, and that's one of them of how to ask for an OPRA or a prior written notice. So a lot of our parents will find that when they go in and they start asking for that NOPRA, it can stop that just brush off that happens to a lot of our families, and make it so that we actually do have a real conversation. I'm going to tell you right now, it's very unlikely that a school would ever put insufficient staff or insufficient funds as a reason for a decision. That's because under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that makes all of our IEPs exist, that's not a valid reason not to provide a service, right? Services that are required for your child to get a free and appropriate public education, they're required. It doesn't matter if the school doesn't have that staff right now. It doesn't matter if they don't have that money right now. That is not a legally acceptable reason. So that's why when you do ask for these NOPRAs, you will find that a lot of conversations that otherwise would not be had are going to be had. And it can also tell you why we're making a decision, because sometimes we get a decision and no explanation as to why. So, big fan of asking for an NOPRA. Next thing we're going to talk about is behavior. And we are jumping around just because it really is the heavy hitters across an IEP. So, with behavior, biggest thing there, think broadly. Um, who is impacted by the behavior is the first question I'm going to ask. So, usually it's the second or third page of your IEP. It has a bunch of check boxes on it. This slide at the bottom has the beginning of that. That very first checkbox says, does the student have behavior which impedes his or her learning or the learning of others? I find in my experience, a lot of times we leave out that middle piece of the sentence, that his or her learning part. A lot of times we're reading this question to ask, does the student have behavior which impedes the learning of others? Are they throwing chairs? Are they hitting their peers? Are they yelling? Are they distracting other people? Are they eloping out of class? Basically, the question that's being asked with behavior a lot of times is, does it impact others? That's not what we're that's not all we're worried about, right? Because if our kid is very, very distractible or goes into their own little world, say they're sitting in class and they're perfectly silent, they are quiet. But they're staring at the out the window all class. They're not paying attention. They're circling their pencil in the air. They're spinning in their chair. All of these things that we see a lot with our kids with autism, a lot with our kids with ADHD, where it is behaviors that are impacting their learning. I'm not learning if I'm staring out the window and not paying attention to what's happening in class. But that usually won't be flagged as a behavior by the IEP team because we're looking at how it impacts others. So I really encourage parents to think broadly when they think behavior. It is not just they're being written up and sent home. It is, are they acting in ways that are getting in the way of their learning? If so, then we have a behavior that we need to be addressing. Even if we're not going to, I've gotten into many arguments about whether this box should be checked yes or no. Even if we check that box no, I want to see strategies, I want to see goals, I want to see support for my child to have ways to change that behavior, and ways to engage more, um, so that they are not impeding their own learning through their behavior. We also look at long-term outcomes of behavior. So many, many times I will get kindergarten, first grader, second grader. They are showing some task refusal. Maybe they just walk away from the desk when they don't want to do something. Maybe they're throwing a paper on the ground. And when they're in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, it can be cute. And it can be all like, that's so sweet. She doesn't, she's really good at telling us when she doesn't want to do this work. Um, and it is kind of cutified. Uh, think of, what does that behavior look like if we allow it to progress? Because if we are engaging in that task refusal, say just walking away, right? What is that kind of behavior going to look like in 4 or 5 years if we do not address it now? When those behaviors are more mild, they're much easier to address, they're much easier to change because we're not stuck in that behavioral pattern, and we haven't allowed it to escalate. We have given other communication forms for that kid. So maybe now instead of just walking away, that student knows how to request a break. And that's something that we can work toward is teaching that student, okay, here's how we request a break. We don't just walk away, right? Or we don't just throw a paper on the ground. So I also encourage parents when we're thinking behavior, not only to think about who is impacted, other people versus student, but also even if that behavior seems mild now, what is the longer term impact of not addressing it now? And you as parent, as advocate, identifying those things will help a lot when you go to that IEP meeting and you can say, I know that this isn't one of your behavior students, but here's a behavior that I'm worried about and that I think is getting in the way of my child's learning. And I think that we need to address it now. Maybe here's some strategies I'm thinking to address it now as opposed to letting it just kind of worsen over time. Um, We also want to be thinking about where and when behaviors are happening. So any kind of behavioral work that we're doing, we're looking at the antecedent and the consequence of the behavior. So that's what happens before and what happens after the behavior. So if my student is always having meltdowns first thing when they get to school, or always having meltdowns right after like recess or something, that is going to tell me that there is something triggering that behavior around that time. Maybe in the morning it's the bus. Maybe the bus is so overwhelming that when the child gets to school, they're so dysregulated that going into a classroom and trying to do your busy work in the morning is just too much. We might need to think about solutions there. We might need to think about maybe a parent contract or a bus behavior plan or something like that to help, or other strategies, fidgets on the bus, earphones on the bus, um, things that can help there. So we always want to be thinking about where behaviors are happening. Are they happening in a certain class? Maybe that class gives a lot of frustration. Maybe that room has a lot going on. Maybe it's by the lunchroom and there's a lot of sounds and smells coming. And then when in the day is it happening? So we can try and identify what the triggers of that behavior are. We're also looking at other possible explanations. Is your kid hungry? Are they tired? Or there are some basic kind of what else could be going on that's causing this behavior. Maybe they are just really dysregulated from the sensory input that they're receiving. It's not always going to be like the traditional reasons that we think behavior happens. So it is really important to think broad in the reasons for behavior and really brainstorm, and this is where the team can come in handy, really brainstorm all the possible explanations for the behavior that's happening. But ultimately, I really do recommend that we bring in help with behavior. And it does not have to be even like super severe behavior. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about what that help looks like, and then talk about how we can use that. So you may be familiar with behavior intervention plans or BIPs. That is basically what the IEP team is going to do if we decide that there is a behavior that needs to be addressed. So these checkboxes, that second one is, does the student have a behavioral intervention plan? I'll say if I see the first one checked yes and the second one checked no, I have a lot of questions. Um, Mainly, how are we addressing behavior then? That behavior intervention plan basically lays out, they identify some target behaviors. Usually, we're going to be working on less than three. We want to start really small in achievable chunks for our kids. So, we really need to identify what are the most severe or troublesome behaviors that we're coming across. And then identify de-escalation techniques or other ways to manage that behavior. We identify different communication tools that we can use because at the end of the day, a lot of our behavior is communication. So if they are trying to communicate, for example, that they need a break, okay, in that behavior intervention plan, in that BIP, I want to see different strategies we can use to empower that student to request a break um, in a way that is better for everybody. Because it is extremely stressful to go through that whole behavior, and it's not great for staff, it's not great for other students. So, if we can give that student tools and teach them other ways to manage that communication, a lot of times we will see reduction in that behavior. But the way that we make that behavior intervention plan is by doing something called a functional behavioral analysis, or an FBA. You can request this as an evaluation. So if I have a kid who has behaviors and I'm kind of concerned about it, even if they're those like low level behaviors, even if it's just task refusal and getting up and not doing anything, or staring out the window, things like that, I might still request an FBA just because I want someone to come in there and take a look at it. Now, I will always request that my FBA is done by a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst. A lot of times with our schools, they will ask teachers to do the FBA, which is great. Nothing against teachers. They are wonderful, amazing, fantastic. They know our kids really well and they're good at what they do in many cases. They have not been trained in behavior though, and they're certainly not board certified in behavior most of the time. Um, so if we're working on a behavior problem, I always say, well, let's bring in a behavior expert. It'd be like asking our teachers to, without the help of an occupational therapist or speech therapist or physical therapist, to just provide those therapies. That's not what they were trained to do. That's not what they went to school for. Everyone is going to be better off and happier, I think, if we get a behavior expert to come in and take a look at our behaviors. That FBA will identify what behaviors they see. It'll track some of that frequency of when those behaviors are happening and how often they're happening. And then they'll also provide some hypotheses about why these behaviors are happening. What's the function of the behaviors? Because again, we're looking at that behavior as communication. What is that behavior trying to communicate? Knowing what that behavior is trying to communicate is going to help us figure out techniques to address the behavior and give that child substitutes for the behavior. So instead of running to the other side of the classroom because you don't want to do your work, we can hold up a card that says, I need a break. Um, and strategies to introduce that card. Um, but that FBA is the first thing that we need to do. So you're going to request the FBA. That can be done in an email. I would recommend writing it down in an email to request. And I would specify I want a board certified behavior analyst to do it. Um, there's also a question of what is the help that we're bringing in? What are their credentials? And you are welcome to ask, parent, advocate, whoever, you are welcome to ask, okay, so you said that an aide is working with my child on behavior. What are their credentials? You are welcome to ask that. Often we will see a BCBA, that board certified behavior analyst. More frequently, we'll see an RBT in the school, a registered behavior technician. Sometimes we will also see a board certified assistant behavior analyst. Both the RBTs and the BCABAs work under a BCBA. Um, but it is good to know when someone is working with your child specifically on that area of behavior that they have some kind of training in behavior and they're being supervised by somebody who is an expert in that behavior. Um, you can also ask, okay, the staff, are they trained on appropriate restraint protocol? Say that we are having behaviors that are resulting in restraints. Can you provide me with a copy of your restraint protocol and have all of those staff been trained in it to make sure that those restraints are appropriate? And finally, any staff working with your kid, if they have a behavior intervention plan, they better be trained on the behavior intervention plan and how to execute it by the person who wrote it. So if you have an outside BCBA come in and contract with the school and create a behavior intervention plan, they don't just write it and walk away. In your IEP meeting, I really recommend trying to advocate for that BCBA to train staff and even train you, parent, on that behavior intervention plan. Because to give it the most success of working, we need to be applying it consistently across settings, and that includes home. Finally, with bringing in that help, you are going to meet again to check progress. And remember that you can always invite those people to come back. So if your child is working with a BCBA or working with an RBT and we're really concerned about behavior, we're having those meetings. When you come back to check progress, be sure to request that those behavior folks are there with you. Okay. We're going to move to assistive technology. Assistive technology is extremely broad. The definition of it in the IDEA is could include many things. Basically, it's going to be any kind of technology that is going to help your student access something in their environment. The most common form of assistive technology that we think of is going to be AAC, that assistive and augmentative communication devices, thinking tablets and things like that, but it can also be a PEC system, a picture card exchange system. Uh, and then they can have nothing to do with communication. It can be adaptive utensils like a gravity spoon where our hand is shaking and moving, but one of our goals is being able to feed ourselves. Well, I've had schools order adaptive utensils for my students to be able to engage in that functional kind of like life skill task. It can include screen readers if my child has a lot of trouble reading things or even with typing. We can turn on predictive text. We can turn on spell check. All of those things are assistive technology. I would say if you have any software that is like on your child's computer, they say, oh, don't worry, we have spell check on the computer and they're allowed to use it. Make sure that one, the disability features are turned on. And then two, that the student actually knows how to access those assistive technology software pieces on the computer. Just because it is available does not mean that we're actually using it. So that's another important thing to check in with. And then assistive technology can also include things like writing tools. It can include slant boards. It can include pencil grips. And it can include like very fat, chunky crayons and markers and stuff like that. Um, but it's very broad. It's anything that's going to help our kid access that educational programming. Um, and when you ask, I would recommend being specific. If you just say assistive technology, schools typically the response is either going to be, "What do you mean?" Or AAC is where they're going. Communication systems is where they're going. And that may be what you're talking about, but you may also have a more broad conception of what all assistive technology includes. So if you are concerned about your child being able to independently feed themselves, okay, adaptive utensils needs to be something we talk about. I would even lump in with this alternate seating. If you have a child who cannot sit in their seat because they need more sensory input, or a child who uses a wheelchair and needs to be moved from that wheelchair every certain period of time, the school can actually purchase alternative seating options for that child. As long as it is needed for them to be able to engage in the educational curriculum, fantastic. The school can order it. Yes, so all of these important to keep in mind. Again, we're thinking broadly. Services. So this is a screenshot of the services page. It's at the very, very back of the IEP, like second to last page is where you'll find these. And with our related services, that's going to include things like speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy. I believe transportation is also a related service. But there are several things in these sections that you need to watch out for. So when you ask for that draft ahead of time and the school gives you the draft, you're reading it over, even if the very first time you're laying eyes on this IEP is in the IEP meeting, sit down and actually read the services section. The first thing you're looking for is who is the provider? Who is providing the service? Does it say that the physical therapist will provide physical therapy services to the student however often? Does it say physical therapist or physical therapist aide will provide? Does it say physical therapist and special education staff will provide? All of those are different, and all of those trigger questions. How often is who doing what? Are there certain tasks the physical therapist needs to do versus the aide versus special ed staff? What does this actually look like? And looking at who's providing the services is one of the first ways that we can get tipped off to these services may not look like how I think that they look. Also look at where the service is being provided. So on the very far right, that column is location of services. And that's going to tell you some more information as well. If your student is in the self-contained room for most of the day, the resource room, the special ed room, whatever your school calls it, if they're in that room most of the day and the service says that it is provided in the resource room, special ed room, whatever, that immediately triggers questions for me of, are we doing larger class sessions, right? How individualized is this service? And all of these are questions that you can ask in the IEP meeting. Like you can ask them, and whoever is there needs to be able to answer them or be able to follow up with someone to answer them. Um, so I would really recommend looking at that location of service to figure out, is this happening in the speech and language room? Is it happening in the gen ed environment? There are some situations where we want those services to be pushed into general education. Is it happening in the resource room where they spend most of their day? What's going on there? We also look at how often that service is being provided. That is something to keep an eye on, especially IEP to IEP. We want to make sure that it's not being reduced without us realizing. And you want to make sure that that number is what you think it is and what seems appropriate for your kid. And if you're not sure if it's appropriate for your kid, we will be talking about evaluations in a second. You'll also the biggest red flag that I've been finding in my IEPs recently, or one, maybe it's a pet peeve, is the inclusion of the word consultative services. So in that service description, it will often say physical therapist will provide direct services to student. Um, I'm going to be looking, a lot of times they say direct and or consultative services to the student. Now, you may be saying, what is consultative? Consultative is where that therapist will actually go in and work with the staff who works with that student and kind of consult on their needs. This is needed in many cases, right? I Speech comes to mind. If your student's using a communication device, consultative services are generally going to be appropriate, because the speech therapist just working with your child one on one or in a small group to work on like social language and stuff. Um, that is not going to train the staff who is working with your child or let the staff see how that student is actually engaging with that communication device and in appropriate ways to model and offer opportunities. So when I see that consultative, my response is, that is fantastic. I am so glad that you guys are doing consultative services. I really do love to see that collaboration. But this related services section, I would like that to be just services for my child, just services that my student is actually receiving, whether that's small group, whether that's one-on-one, whatever that looks like. I need that part to be in the related service. That consultative part can be pulled out and stuck into that section you have called support for personnel. Because that's what that consultative service really is it's you're supporting other school staff, other school personnel. So whenever I see consultative, I'm going to flag it and ask, either we need to take it out or we need to move it into support for personnel and provide that as a separate service under the IEP. Um, Another thing for parents, advocates to be looking at is how it says services are being provided. There are situations where small group is going to be better than one-on-one for service. Language again is coming to mind. Our kids learn through watching others, and that social language isn't something that we can work on completely in a one-on-one setting. If it is really something that you are concerned about, and I've done it a couple times, I will actually have them pull out and separate one-on-one and small group services. So I have a student who speech, one of them is listed as a small group service. They get that once a week for 20 minutes, speech and small group. Then once a week for 20 minutes, they are getting speech one-on-one because they need both, and those both serve different purposes. But in our IEP, if it's written to say and or to include possibly this list of things, that means that the school can provide that and it's perfectly legal. They could do the bare minimum outlined in that service description. Often they'll do more, but worst case scenario, they could be doing that bare minimum. So I like to make my IEPs a bit more robust so that the bare minimum is higher. Okay. We're talking about evaluations, and the biggest thing I get with evaluations is parents don't realize the extent of evaluations, the different options available for evaluations. And the underlying question, whenever we're doing an evaluation, is going to be, what would be helpful to make goals or decide on accommodations in the IEP? What kind of information do you need to decide what things your student needs in that IEP, or just generally to be successful in that school environment? And the school, at a bare minimum, they do have to talk about evaluations every 3 years. So students are supposed to be reevaluated every 3 years. A lot of times we come to that 3 year mark and I hear the phrase of, okay, well, we know that your student has autism. That's not changing, right? So why do we need to reevaluate? I think that we can just sign consent not to evaluate. We're just going to pass it along. We know they still have autism. We know they still have issues with speech. We know they still have issues with OT. No need to evaluate here. Now, that might be fine in some situations, but I do know the kids I work with, they change a lot in 3 years. An evaluation from 3 years ago, behavioral observations from 3 years ago are not going to tell me a lot about where my kid is operating today. You can also request evaluations at any time. You don't have to wait for that 3 year mark to be there. The place you're going to start for figuring out evaluations is by looking at your student's eligibility report. If you don't have it on hand, most of my parents don't, you can just email your school's case manager. Usually that's going to be your special education teacher, whoever is writing the IEP and emailing with you with stuff about that. email them and ask for a copy of the eligibility report. And they should be able to send you a copy of that. On there, you can see when it was last done, all of the different evaluations they did, and when those evaluations were done, and then the brief description of what those results are. So that's really my first place to start. I look at what evaluations we've checked in with, how long it's been since we've done them. Um, this is the form that they use. It's called Notice of Consent for Reevaluation. It has a bunch of check boxes for evaluations that you could be doing. It does not need to fall in one of those listed check boxes. Those are just some options. There are several boxes that say other, and they say other for a reason. It's because we can write in other testing options. Um, the timelines with special education only start, so they have 60 days to do evaluations, and that only begins once you sign this form. That's why I put a picture of this form in here, because you need to know what it looks like. If you sit down at a meeting and you just agree out loud to be reevaluated, and then a month later you check back on how it's going and they say, oh, we needed this consent form, your timeline hasn't started. So that 60 days that kicks in once we agree to test only kicks in once we sign this form. So be on the lookout for this form. You can specifically ask them to pull it up. They have access to it in Power School. If they're saying that's not what we're meeting about today, well, we can modify all of that in Power School, and sign consent to change the meeting to include evaluations. If you have more detailed questions about those, an intake call with ADAP would be appropriate, or a call to APEC, Parent Education Center. They're also typically able to help. I've given a list of different types of evaluations that I use pretty frequently. So achievement, IQ, adaptive functional skills, assistive technology, behavior, language, which includes expressive, that's the language that you're putting out, receptive, what language you're understanding, and then pragmatic, which is more of our social language. Developmental skills, executive functioning skills, motor skills, both fine and gross, sensory, transition, ADHD, autism, the list goes on. Um, but if I have a student come in and they're going to have some issues, maybe I'm seeing in their IEP multiple references to them getting overstimulated, or there was one I was looking at where like the child kept kicking off their shoes. It didn't like to wear socks either. And I was like, okay, there's sensory things happening. We need to take a look at that because that student also had behaviors. We need to stop, take a look at that sensory piece, and see how much that's influencing behavior. So that particular student, I said, let's go in and get a sensory evaluation. The person who typically does that is going to be an occupational therapist. And often you will probably have to have an outside person come in and do a very thorough sensory evaluation, because the first line of sensory evaluations are often checkboxes. Um, but you can get as specific as you want in requesting tests. I will request specific types of IQ tests for my kids. I will use those often to both assess school situations, but then also to turn around and use it in the Medicaid waiver context. But for all of this, you can say specific types of tests that you think would be helpful if you have come across any of those. If you have no idea, that is fine. And just requesting tests in these areas that are not commonly tested is a win. If you're not sure about testing, if you'd like someone to just talk through about all of this, again, giving us ADAP or APEC a call, not a bad idea. Next thing we're going to talk about, independent educational evaluations. A lot of people don't know that these exist. They're called IEEs. And this is a sample email for how you would request one of those. So say, I'm going to go back a slide, say that we got in a language evaluation. They looked at their expressive, receptive, and pragmatic language, but it really just seems like they did a checklist. Maybe when I'm looking at it, it just doesn't sound like my student, or it's not as thorough as I was hoping for. I have questions that aren't answered that the speech pathologist has not been able to answer. You can turn around and request an independent evaluation. So what that is basically a provider of your choice, private provider, will be able to come in and do that evaluation at school expense, which is huge. Often, actually, I see this with autism too. I often will opt for an independent after getting that first evaluation done. because more nuanced views of autism are not really captured by many of the tests that we see in school. So I'll want to go to a professional who works more frequently with autistic children and can identify children who may be high masking, and it's harder to see just based on a psychometrist doing an ADOS or something. So the thing with the IEE, you do have to request it within 1 year of when an evaluation was done. So, say we're in June right now, say that my child had evaluations done last August. It is not too late to turn around and look at those evaluations again, go through them, see whether they're too vague or whether you agree with them, whether that sounds like your kid that's being described. Um, and if you disagree with any of those results or need more information, don't think it was done well enough, you can request an independent evaluation. The only thing that you have to say is that you are requesting an independent evaluation, the area you want it to be in. It has to be an area that the school has tested within the last year, and that you disagree. You do not have to state why you disagree. You do not have to give them that reason. A lot of schools have their own internal forms and processes for requesting these, and those forms may have a space for you to put in why you disagree. You do not have to fill it in. You can also choose a provider of your choice. The school can provide you with a list of providers they've contracted with before, if that would be helpful for you. And the school does ultimately have to approve that provider. Usually it's stuff like they are actually qualified to provide this service. It is not more expensive than most other evaluations of this type. It is within a certain geographical radius. I've seen that one too. But generally, it's going to be whoever you pick. And the good piece with this is often providers will keep separate waiting lists. So if you look at a provider and you say, oh my gosh, their autism evaluation waiting list is 2 years long, if you get school to do autism evaluation, don't agree with the results, you can get an IEE. Oftentimes you can get in less than a year, easy, for the same provider. So very, 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 very important thing to keep in mind. Okay, then we're going to talk about goals. Yes, please post questions. Um, Data with goals. So one place data is helpful is in this present levels of academic achievement and functional performance section that tells us where your student's currently performing. If we have a goal and I don't know where the student's currently performing on it, I don't know whether that goal is adequately challenging. I don't know whether that goal is achievable. It's not really, I'm not really able to tell. So it's really important to read that present level section and see if you can tell kind of where your student is performing on the goal that we're trying to test them on. The other thing to note on this is at the very bottom, types of evaluation for annual goals. I almost always want to see data collection marked, because all of our goals typically are going to say things like 80% success in 3 out of 5 trials, 4 out of 5 trials, whatever. To know whether we met that goal, I need to see data that we met that goal. I don't want to just sit there and guess whether my student was able to do their multiplication tables with 80% accuracy in 3 out of 5 trials. Like, that's not really a thing we're good at guessing. So show me the data from when you worked with the student. So I will advocate when we get to that goal section, I'll say, hey, do you mind marking that data collection? If they are already taking some kind of data, they say, oh, we already do that. We're doing it this way, this way, this way. I say, fantastic. Sounds like you're already doing it. So let's mark that box. So big fan of data collection being marked. The other place where we get data is on these annual goal progress reports. You're supposed to get something that looks like this every 9 weeks, that tells you what progress your student is making on their goals. Often we will see 2s and 3s as how they mark our goals. Um, it is important to keep up with this because if we're saying throughout the year that we're anticipating mastery, that's that 2, or that some progress is made, I'm going to be asking to see that progress. And when they send those goal reports home or progress reports home, or if you don't get one, this is a really good chance to check in and see where we are on our IEP goals and ask for data on where we are on our IEP goals. The other piece is how to write our IEP goals. So we're big fans of SMART goals. That's specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. I want all of my IEP goals to have these characteristics. I'm going to run through them again really quickly. Specific, we want our goals to be clear and specific. we need to say more than just saying like Adam will be a better reader or Adam will improve in math. We need to say specifically what are we looking at. Um, this example I like a lot because it says he'll be able to read a passage orally in a grade level book at these words per minute with random errors. Often I'll see that they're able to read a text or able to read a passage, but we don't state the grade level. So it is really important that we are specifying exactly what we're looking at. If we are working on learning buttons for 10 words, learning communication buttons for 10 words or 5 words, whatever, I want to have a list of words that we are working on so that I, as parent, can go home and work with them on the same words. It also gives me something that I can measure at the end of the year saying, okay, here's our list of words you gave me. Where are we on each of them? So as specific as you can get, awesome. We do need our goals to be measurable because if we can't measure how our goals went, we don't know if we met them. So instead of just Emma will be able to solve math problems, we need to say Emma will be able to solve math problems that involve, here we are talking about fractions and decimals with 75% accuracy. I want to know what is our baseline for success. The goals do need to be attainable. If my student is writing at a kindergarten level, they're in 7th grade, and we say they'll write at grade level, that's not very attainable for my student. So we also need to be thinking, is this something that my student can actually achieve, but would still be challenging for them? Relevant. A lot of times I see this with math and then also with kind of you can have functional goals in your IEP. Then they'll put a functional goal in. Maybe it's wipe the table down after snack. Is that the most important functional thing that your child needs to learn, or would it be more helpful for them to be able to communicate when they're hungry or communicate when they need to go to the bathroom? So it's really important to evaluate those goals and ask those questions of, is there a goal that we could get that is more relevant to my student? Totally fair question to ask. You can ask, why did you choose that goal? And a lot of times it'll get at this relevance. Goal obviously needs to be time-based. Often it'll be the end of the school year. If we have benchmarks in our goal, it's often like December and March, I think is what I typically see with those two benchmarks. And our goals do need to be time-based. Okay. Last thing, ADAP, we are doing a priority survey to figure out what is important to the community, what kinds of areas we need to be working in, and what issues you guys are seeing. So if you could either fill out that survey or if you want to participate in a focus group, you can fill out the other one to say when and where you would be available for that. If you need a different format, you can always call us or email us and request that additional format. So yes, okay. Can anything be added to the IEP? I'm looking at this one question. Um, to address behaviors by other children. For instance, a patient has been attacked several times by the same student who also has special needs, and the school has told the mother that this cannot be addressed in the IEP, and the mother does not feel that her child is safe at school because of the behaviors of the other child. It is a very, very good question. Yes, it can be. So we can come up with, usually it'll be called like a safety plan for the student. It can look like changing schedules, changing staff, positioning the students like desks and things in different areas. You obviously can't advocate for the other student to have a behavioral intervention plan, but it is something to take a look at, and you can develop a safety plan for your student. One thing to be careful with there is not punishing the student who's being attacked. So if the student who is having the aggression toward them, um, if they are the only ones whose schedule is changing, if they're the ones having to make all of the sacrifices in the schedule, I'm going to have some issues with that because it isn't their fault. It's not really either one's fault. If we get into, we need to address these behaviors. But it is something that can be handled. It is hard to handle though. But yeah, you can definitely have a safety plan. I have a 3-year-old daughter with an autism diagnosis in the process of evaluations now. You had your psychometrist evaluation yesterday. Do I have any specific advice for preschool parents? The school also does not have a 3-year-old preschool, so what obligations does the school have to meet as far as preschool goes? Oh, yes, preschool's hard. It's a bit squishier. The main thing that I'm looking at with pre-K and preschool is what does that school offer to non-disabled children? And then whatever they offer to disabled children needs to match. There can't be discrimination there. So if they have a 3-year-old class for general ed students who are non-disabled, and that class meets 5 times a week, maybe for half days, I need to see the same thing for my disabled students. If not, we've got some discrimination issues happening if they're receiving public funds. Also with preschool parents, um, it is hard because our services are going to be much less usually in that preschool setting. So our expectations are a little bit lower. But I would really encourage focusing on um, just very like communication, honestly. Communication and behavior are the two areas that for my little kids, I want to see us hit hard. Because if we don't have those kind of under control, if we don't have strategies to deal with those, it's going to be much, much harder later on to address. But then also, they're not going to be able to really benefit from the educational program in the same way if they're not able to communicate effectively and if they're not able to manage behavior in a way that lets them engage productively. Um, but ultimately, with that preschool parent, that would be a good place to talk to APEC about, the Alabama Parent Education Center, and they would be able to walk you through that as well. Um, and yeah, without having that 3-year-old preschool, it is unfortunate. But if the school's not offering it for that general education side, they don't really have much of an obligation to provide services. Yes. So I would definitely go ahead and start that conversation about assistive technology. It says, "Thank you so much. She's nonverbal. So can we ask for AAC in preschool?" Um, Go ahead and get that started. I would include that. Usually they will not do it as part of that initial evaluation because that initial evaluation, they're often looking at just what do we need for eligibility. Once we have our eligibility determined, they say, yes, she gets an IEP. Then that is when I would really strongly push for you to go ahead and start pushing on that assistive technology, that AAC piece. Um, because wait lists to get evaluated there are often long. If you're not already, go ahead and connect with Children's Rehab Services, CRS, because they are probably the biggest group in the state doing assistive technology and AAC evaluations. Um, with that training for you, I, you can push for parent training on that AAC. And then I would also ask if you have an outside speech person, ask them to show you the minute how to access the usage data on that AAC, because that can be a key in figuring out whether we are actually. And with AAC, another tangent. You can bring that home with you, even if the school provides it. Because if we can show that that is necessary for that student's education, which language across settings is necessary for them to be able to pick it up, you can actually be able to take that AAC home with you. On their communication. Mm. Yes. And Jenny asked way back when I was talking about behavior, about a behavior intervention plan, whether that would be a good choice to be proactive. Yes. I recommend us getting behavior intervention plans before the behavior reaches a crisis point, just because, again, they're going to be easier to access or change at that point. All right.
Cecilia, thank you so much for your time today and everybody that joined us. This was fantastic information, and if you all want to share it with people that you know, we will be posting it to our YouTube page by next week. And check out our YouTube page for our previous webinar Wednesdays that we have had. Again, Thank you for your time, Cecilia, and everybody that joined us today. We will be having a webinar in July. So check out our social media for follow-ups on that. You guys have a great day. Take care. Thank you.